stripping Meghan and Andrew of their titles was the right course.
The moment did not arrive with shouting. It arrived with silence. Behind the sealed doors of Buckingham Palace, King Charles made the decision that no monarch before him had dared to complete. Prince Andrew was to be stripped of all remaining titles, privileges, ceremonial recognition, and royal protections tied to the crown. One signature turned a family scandal into a constitutional rupture, and no one inside the palace could pretend the monarchy was unchanged. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles sat alone with the file before him, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The order meant a royal command, a written decision carrying the authority of the monarch, and this one removed Andrew's remaining titles, honorary distinctions, ceremonial roles, palace privileges, and public recognition within the royal structure. Those titles were not just words before a name, they were signals of rank and belonging. Those ceremonial roles were not empty traditions. They told the country who still stood inside the royal circle. Charles understood why this mattered. If the crown kept protecting a damaged name, the public would see weakness instead of judgment. If he cut too deep, the family wound would never fully close. The king rested his hand near the pen for longer than expected. He had warned Andrew before. He had watched private pressure build behind polished doors. He had heard concern from advisors who no longer believed soft limits could protect the monarchy. Still, this was his brother. Andrew had shared childhood rooms, family tables, and memories no scandal could erase. Charles did not sign with triumph. He signed with sorrow, cutting away part of his past to protect the future. Andrew received the news in a private room, and the words landed like a sentence he had never believed would come. He went pale, then still. His name had survived years of narrowing doors, reduced duties, and cold public distance. But this was different. This was final. Andrew had not merely lost invitations. He had lost the royal shape around his identity. The silence around him became unbearable, because no one rushed to soften it. William stood apart from the act itself, but understood its shadow. The prince knew this decision would shape the monarchy he would one day inherit, and he knew Charles had crossed a line no future king could ignore. Camilla watched the monarch after the signature, and she saw no relief. She saw the cost. Outside that closed door, the palace prepared to inform Andrew, and private blood was about to collide with public duty. A royal punishment is never only about the person named in the order. It moves through every corridor, every relationship, every memory that once made the family feel untouchable. Charles saw a brother. William saw a warning. Camilla saw a monarchy bleeding from old wounds. Andrew saw everything he had clung to being pulled away at once, and the silence around him felt colder than any public statement. Charles carried the decision like a stone pressed against his chest. The crown meant the authority and public trust of the monarchy, not just the jewels, palaces, or ceremonies people saw from the outside. That was why this moment mattered so deeply. If the king protected Andrew too much, the public would believe royal blood still stood above consequence. If he punished him too harshly, the family would feel the cut for years. Charles understood both truths, and neither one gave him comfort. Andrew did not see himself as a man being disciplined. He saw himself as a man being erased. His identity had been built around rank, ceremony, access, and the steady belief that his place near power could never fully disappear. A royal title meant an official style or position that told the world where someone stood inside the monarchy, and Andrew had lived under that shield for most of his life. Now that shield had cracked. He felt humiliation first, then anger, then a disbelief so sharp it left him unable to answer. William watched the fallout with a colder kind of sadness. The prince understood that his future reign could not begin under the shadow of old scandals and unfinished decisions. He had seen how one unresolved name could drag the whole monarchy backward, pulling attention away from duty, service, and the next generation. William did not celebrate Andrew's fall. He understood the cost, but he also knew that weakness, once tolerated, becomes inheritance. Camilla saw the danger from another angle. The queen consort knew reputation could bleed slowly, and she knew the palace could not survive another season of guarded explanations and half measures. She watched Charles closely, not as a strategist alone, but as a wife seeing the sadness behind his control. Camilla recognized that the king had not chosen comfort. He had chosen survival. Charles finally told William the truth in a controlled private exchange. with no warmth in the room and no easy words between them. The king said this was no longer about punishment. It was about preservation. William absorbed the sentence without interrupting, because he understood what it meant. Andrew had lost more than status, but the monarchy had almost lost something greater. Yet the order did not appear from nowhere. It was born from one private incident that changed the palace mood forever. Every palace crisis has a moment people later whisper about as the beginning of the end. For Andrew, that moment came during a private Windsor dinner, when a carefully controlled family gathering turned unbearable. A single remark, a tightened face, a chair pushed back from the table, and Charles understood what years of warnings had failed to prove. The old arrangement could not survive another day. Andrew had lived for years inside a shrinking circle, yet he still reached for the symbols that made him feel protected. Royal symbols meant the visible signs of rank, such as titles, uniforms, invitations, and places at official family events. They mattered because they told the world who still belonged and who had been pushed away. Palace aides had tried to manage him quietly, limiting appearances, reducing access, and avoiding open confrontation. That quiet approach mattered because silence had become the palace's shield. But silence also allowed Andrew to believe the shield was still his. Charles had watched that belief harden into defiance. The king had accepted half measures for too long, hoping restraint would prevent another wound from opening inside the family. Camilla had seen the strain grow in him, and she knew each quiet compromise carried a public cost. The queen consort understood that every unexplained privilege looked like protection, and every protected mistake threatened the trust Charles needed to keep. Then the Windsor dinner changed everything. Windsor was not just a royal home, it was a family seat closely tied to monarchy, memory, and continuity. That mattered because the argument did not happen in some distant office. It happened at the heart of the family's own story. Andrew challenged William's authority in front of Charles, questioning whether the prince had the courage to protect the family when his own reign came. The words cut through the room. Andrew did not merely defend himself. He dared to measure the future king in front of the present one. William remained controlled, but the wound showed. The prince did not answer quickly, because any reply would have turned the dinner into open warfare. Charles saw the silence on his son's face and understood the damage. Andrew had not accepted that his place had changed. He had turned a private family meal into a direct challenge to royal order, and the king knew that if he ignored it, the weakness would belong to him. Camilla saw the moment land before anyone named it. She watched Charles set down his glass, slowly and deliberately, as if the sound ended more than a conversation. The monarch told Andrew the discussion was over. Then he left the room without another word. Andrew stayed behind, still angry, still proud, but the old protection around him had cracked. That unfinished sentence at Windsor followed them back to Buckingham, where restraint finally gave way to confrontation. The confrontation was not staged for cameras, courtiers, or history books. It happened in a private room where two brothers faced each other without the protection of ceremony. Charles entered as king. Andrew stood there as a man who still believed birthright could shield him. But when the door closed, there were no uniforms, no crowds, no titles strong enough to soften what had to be said. Charles did not rush toward the hardest sentence. The king knew that ceremony meant the formal customs, uniforms, honors, and public gestures that make royal status visible to the world. That mattered because Andrew had lived behind those signs for decades, using them as proof that he still belonged near the center of power. This meeting mattered for another reason too. If Charles treated the decision like paperwork, Andrew would call it betrayal. If he treated it like family pain, the monarchy might look afraid of its own authority. Andrew arrived expecting a negotiation. He believed the monarch would leave him something, some symbolic remnant of rank that could be held up later as proof that the door had not fully closed. Andrew spoke first with tight control, asking what exactly would remain. Charles watched him carefully, and the silence between them carried more force than any raised voice. The king understood then that his brother had not come to accept the decision. He had come to bargain with it. Charles finally told him the truth. The crown could no longer carry the weight of his name. The crown, in plain terms, meant the monarchy as an institution, the public trust, duties, and authority resting on the sovereign. That trust had become the central issue. Andrew heard the words and stiffened, because Charles was no longer speaking like a brother trying to manage embarrassment. He was speaking like a monarch drawing a line through history. Andrew's anger broke through. He accused Charles of choosing public approval over family loyalty, of letting pressure decide what blood should protect. Andrew gripped the back of a chair, as if the wood beneath his hand was the last steady thing in the room. Charles did not move. The king told him the order removed all remaining recognition connected to the monarchy, and the calmness of that sentence was more devastating than fury. It proved there was no path back. Charles saw the shock pass across Andrew's face, but he did not soften the decision. The monarch knew one weak word would reopen everything. Andrew stood there breathing hard, wounded by the loss, and insulted by the finality. He wanted outrage to change the room, but outrage found no opening. Charles had already crossed the point where pity could rule him. Andrew left without bowing his head. The door closed behind him with a sound that made the whole decision feel real. Charles remained still, carrying the pain of the brother he had just cut away, and the burden of the crown he had chosen instead. Yet the confrontation revealed only the surface. Behind Charles's decision stood a harder question of power, control, and succession. The monarchy does not survive on affection alone. It survives on discipline, optics, and the ruthless ability to sacrifice what threatens the whole. Behind the emotional fracture between Charles and Andrew stood a larger force, the future of the crown itself. William understood it, Camilla understood it, and Charles, after years of hesitation, finally accepted that mercy without consequence had become a danger. Charles stood by the window after the confrontation, and the stillness around him felt heavier than the argument itself. The crown meant the monarchy's authority, public trust, and duty passed through the sovereign, not just a crown worn in ceremony. That mattered because every royal decision was judged by more than family feeling. If the king allowed Andrew to keep even a soft shadow of status, people would see protection where they expected accountability. If he acted too late, the future would inherit the stain of delay. Charles knew this was why the decision could not be softened now. Camilla entered quietly, and she understood the look on his face before he spoke. The queen consort saw no victory in him. She saw grief. Charles had not only disciplined Andrew, he had severed a bond that began long before scandal, headlines, and public judgment. Camilla knew why that mattered. A monarchy can survive anger from the outside, but it struggles when private guilt weakens public action. She watched the king hold himself together because the palace needed certainty, even while the brother inside him was breaking. William arrived with careful words and a colder sense of the future. The prince knew his own reign could not begin with unresolved weakness tied to the family name. He told Charles the monarchy had to look forward, not backward, but he spoke gently because he saw the pain behind the king's silence. William understood that succession was not only about who comes next in the royal line, it was the transfer of trust from one generation to another. If that trust arrived damaged, his future would begin under someone else's shadow. Charles listened without turning the moment into debate. The monarch knew William was right, and that knowledge hurt almost as much as the decision itself. Andrew's defiance had forced a question no family wanted to answer. Would the palace protect one man's pride, or would it protect the institution millions were asked to believe in? Charles had chosen the institution, but the choice left a mark. Aides began preparing separate language for the household, the family, and the public. That careful wording mattered because each audience would hear the decision differently. Staff needed instructions, relatives needed warning, the country needed clarity. Andrew's next move remained the dangerous unknown. If he accepted the order quietly, the wound might close under pressure. If he resisted, the punishment could become a full public rupture. Charles understood that the signature was only the beginning. Camilla saw it too. William felt it most sharply because the future now depended on whether the past would finally release its grip. And when the first consequences reached Andrew's door, the private punishment became a lived reality. Titles can sound abstract until they disappear from a letterhead, a door plate, a staff briefing, a ceremonial list. For Andrew, the punishment became real in small, brutal details. A name removed here, a privilege withdrawn there, a uniform no longer permitted, a palace entrance no longer available. The crown did not collapse on him all at once. It dismantled his old life, piece by piece. Andrew faced the first consequence through a formal envelope, and his hand paused before he opened it. A royal designation meant the official wording used to identify someone's place inside the monarchy, and that wording mattered because it appeared in records, invitations, security lists, and household instructions. Once those words vanished, the removal was no longer symbolic. It became practical. It changed who could enter, where he could stand, and how the palace itself would speak his name. Andrew read the first line twice, as if repetition might make it less final. Staff moved quickly because Charles had refused to leave the order half done. The king knew that a softened punishment would look like another palace compromise, and another compromise would only feed the belief that consequence stopped at the royal door. A ceremonial list was revised before the ink on the order seemed dry. That list meant the official plan for who could attend formal royal events. And Andrew's removal mattered because ceremonies were where belonging became visible. One missing name told the entire household that the old protection had ended. Andrew stared at an old framed photograph and felt the cruelty of memory. In that image, he still belonged. In the room around him, he did not. His anger rose first, but then something quieter followed it. Humiliation. The kind that does not shout because it has nowhere to go. Andrew had spent years believing the institution might shrink his role, but never reject his identity completely. Now the institution had done exactly that, and it had done so under his brother's authority. Sarah Ferguson heard the news and fell silent. She understood at once that this was not only Andrew's fall. It touched every person connected to his orbit, every family habit, every public appearance, every future invitation that would now carry an absence. Sarah did not defend him in that moment. She simply absorbed the new reality, knowing his humiliation would reach beyond one room. William remained controlled but watchful. The prince understood that Andrew's reaction could close the crisis or tear it wider. Charles refused to reverse the order, even as the personal damage became visible. The monarch had chosen firmness, and now firmness had consequences. Andrew lowered himself into a chair with the envelope still open in his hand, and the silence around him felt complete. But the true turning point came not through paperwork, but through one private exchange where pride finally met consequence. After the anger came the silence. Not the silence of strategy or palace discipline, but the heavier silence between two people who understood that something permanent had happened. Charles and Andrew met once more, without aides, without advisors, without anyone to soften the words. This time there was no argument waiting at the door. There was only the wreckage of a brotherhood reshaped by duty. Charles entered knowing there was nothing left to offer. The order had already taken effect, and an order meant a formal command from the monarch that carried force inside the royal household. That mattered because Andrew could no longer treat the decision as a warning, a pause, or a bargaining position. It had moved from discussion into reality. The absence of aides mattered too. Without staff, no one could translate pain into careful language. Without advisors, no one could hide the truth behind procedure. Andrew looked different without anger leading him. He still carried pride, but it no longer filled the room. For the first time, disbelief sat heavier than outrage. He asked Charles whether there was truly nothing left to preserve, not even one small piece of recognition that could let him stand apart from total humiliation. Andrew wanted the answer to bend. He wanted blood to matter one last time. But the king had already learned that blood, once placed above public trust, could poison everything it touched. Charles showed sorrow, but not hesitation. He told Andrew that affection could remember what had been lost, but affection could not restore what public trust had withdrawn. Public trust meant the belief that people place in the monarchy to act with fairness, discipline, and responsibility. That mattered because the crown could not demand loyalty from the country while appearing to excuse weakness inside its own walls. Charles understood the cruelty of the sentence as he spoke it. Andrew understood it too, and that made the room colder. Charles placed the unsigned spare copy of the order face down on the table. The gesture ended the last illusion of negotiation. Andrew stared at the paper, then stopped reaching for argument. He had fought the decision as if it were an insult. Now he began absorbing it as a loss. His anger did not vanish, but it weakened. Something in him shifted from resistance to recognition, and that shift hurt more than shouting ever could. Charles left the room first, but not with victory in his steps. The monarch paused at the door, carrying the knowledge that the monarchy had survived at the cost of family tenderness. Andrew remained behind, no longer protected by rank, no longer lifted by ceremony, no longer able to pretend the old arrangement could return. By the time the palace doors opened to the outside world, the private wound had already become a national spectacle. The country did not wake to a rumor. It woke to a verdict. By morning, the decision had escaped the palace walls and landed across Britain with the force of history. Broadcasters spoke in measured tones, Crowds gathered near royal gates, and one newspaper front page reduced decades of privilege to 4 merciless words. The monarchy had acted, and the public understood exactly what had changed. Andrew saw the front page before he heard the full broadcast. A front page meant the main story printed on the first page of a newspaper, the place reserved for events too large to hide inside ordinary columns. That mattered because the punishment had left the private rooms of the palace and entered the national memory. A major London newspaper ran a stark black and white image of Andrew beneath the headline, "The titles are gone." The words gave his humiliation a shape the whole country could hold in its hands. Charles absorbed the coverage without celebration. The king understood that public approval could not erase private damage, and it could not turn family grief into victory. Broadcasters called the decision his most severe internal royal action since becoming monarch, and that framing mattered because it showed the public no longer saw the move as housekeeping. They saw it as a line drawn through the royal family itself. Charles had wanted clarity. Now clarity had arrived with a brutal sound. A crowd gathered outside Buckingham Palace, not in wild celebration, but in tense attention. People watched the gates as if the building might speak. Buckingham Palace meant the central working home of the monarchy, the place people connect with royal decisions, royal duty, and national symbolism. That mattered because the crowd was not simply watching a scandal. They were watching the institution answer for itself. The silence outside the gates felt almost heavier than noise. One commentator gave the moment its sharpest public phrase during a live morning broadcast. He said, "This is not a reshuffle. This is a royal severance." A reshuffle meant a simple change in roles, but severance meant a clean break, a cutting away. The phrase spread because it explained what people felt. Andrew had not been moved aside. Andrew had been removed from the structure that once protected him. William studied the coverage with quiet resolve. The prince recognized that painful discipline had restored a measure of institutional clarity, even if it had come at a human cost. He knew the future could not be built on avoidance. Charles knew it too, though the king carried the burden differently. Andrew turned the newspaper over without reading the full article, unable to face the public shape of his fall. And when the noise finally settled, one question remained inside the palace. What had this decision truly cost? And what had it saved? In the end, the decision was not only about Andrew. It was about whether the monarchy could still draw a line and make that line matter. Charles did not emerge untouched. William did not emerge naive. Andrew did not emerge unchanged. The crown survived the day, but it did so by proving that blood could no longer outrank consequence. That was the verdict history would remember. Charles carried the victory like a wound. The crown meant the monarchy's authority, trust, and duty. Not only the jewels and ceremonies people associate with royalty. That mattered because Andrew's removal showed the public that royal birth could no longer protect a person forever from institutional consequence. It mattered for another reason too. The king had not punished a stranger. He had chosen the monarchy over his own brother, and that choice left a silence no public approval could fill. Andrew faced the final shape of isolation. His royal architecture meant the titles, privileges, invitations, protections, and formal recognition that had built his public identity for decades. Without that structure, he was forced to confront a life no longer held up by palace language. Andrew had lost more than rank. He had lost the world that once explained who he was. The punishment did not simply remove him from lists. It removed the illusion that he could remain untouched while the monarchy carried the damage. William understood the meaning with quiet force. The prince knew the monarchy he would inherit now stood on a firmer but harsher foundation. That mattered because his future could not be built on avoidance, delay, or old loyalties that placed comfort above trust. William did not see Andrew's fall as a moment of celebration. He saw it as a warning written into the family's own history. The crown had survived, but it had survived by learning to cut away what threatened its future. Camilla watched Charles after the praise faded, and she understood the loneliness of command. The queen consort saw that the king had gained authority but lost peace. Charles sat alone at his desk, with the signed order before him, then placed it inside a closed folder. The gesture was small, but final. He rested his hand on it for a moment, as if the weight of the decision had not ended with the signature. Then the monarch turned away. The verdict was clear. Andrew's royal chapter had closed. Charles's reign had hardened. William's future had sharpened. Camilla had seen the cost of survival up close. The monarchy was not healed by the decision. but it was strengthened by the courage to stop protecting what threatened it. There was no unresolved ending here. The crown stepped forward, carrying both the scar and the lesson. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.